That old piece of junk isn't worth the shelf space it's taking up. You want my honest advice? Donate it to a scrapyard. Save yourself the embarrassment." The words landed in the quiet of the repair shop like something dropped from a great height. 76-year-old Edmund Goss stood at the counter, holding a wooden clock case wrapped in an old flannel shirt, and he didn't flinch. He simply looked at the young man behind the counter, Nathan Cole, 28 years old, third-generation watchmaker by inheritance if not by temperament, and waited. "I'm not trying to be rude," Nathan continued, though his tone suggested otherwise. He'd barely glanced at the clock before rendering his verdict. "But honestly, mister, what did you say your name was?" "I didn't," Edmund said. Nathan smirked. "Look, whoever you are, that movement is shot. The escapement's probably fused. The mainspring looks original, which means it's 100 years old and ready to snap. And that case," he waved a hand dismissively at the cracked walnut housing, "that's not even furniture-grade wood anymore. You'd spend $3,000 restoring something worth maybe $400 on a good day at auction. I've been doing this for 6 years. I know what I'm looking at." Edmund wrapped the clock back in the flannel without a word. His hands were steady. They were always steady, even now, even at 76, even after everything. He tucked the bundle under his arm and walked out of Cole & Sons' fine timepieces without looking back. What Nathan Cole did not know, what no one in Millhaven, Tennessee had any reason to know, was that Edmund Reese Goss had spent 31 years repairing the most precise mechanical instruments on Earth. Not clocks for rich clients, not display pieces for hotel lobbies. Edmund had worked inside a Navy facility so classified that the building itself didn't appear on any public map, maintaining the chronometric systems aboard nuclear submarines, the timing mechanisms in targeting equipment, the delicate balance wheels and escapements that, if they failed by even a fraction of a second, could mean the difference between a missile hitting its mark and killing the wrong people. He had been consulted by Swiss manufacturers. He had trained Navy officers who went on to teach at Annapolis. He had once been flown to Geneva on a government transport to examine a movement that no living watchmaker could diagnose, and he had found the problem in 40 minutes. None of that was on his business card. He didn't have a business card. He had a small house on Persimmon Road, a vegetable garden, a dog named General, and a workshop in his garage that hadn't been fully opened in 8 years. If you believe that skill earned in a lifetime deserves more than a 28-year-old's dismissal, type the word craftsmanship in the comments before we go any further. Edmund Reese Goss had come to Millhaven 11 years ago, after his wife Beverly passed, after his daughter moved to Portland, after the government facility where he'd spent his career was quietly decommissioned and its work absorbed into a newer installation in Virginia. He had followed no particular reason to Millhaven. It was small, it was quiet. It had a hardware store within walking distance and a diner that served breakfast until 2 in the afternoon, and that was sufficient. He bought the house on Persimmon Road for cash and introduced himself to his neighbors as a retired federal employee, which was true as far as it went. His neighbors knew him as a quiet man who kept his lawn immaculate and occasionally left squash on their porches without announcement. They knew he walked General every morning at 6, that he drove a truck that was older than most of their marriages, and that he waved when he passed but never stopped to talk unless spoken to first. Some of them thought he was lonely. Some of them thought he was unfriendly. None of them thought anything that came close to the truth. The clock had come out of his attic on a Saturday morning in November when Edmund was reorganizing boxes that hadn't been touched since the move. It was wrapped in the same flannel shirt he'd put it in before packing, and when he unwrapped it in the pale November light coming through the garage window, he sat with it for a long time before speaking. "All right," he said, to no one and nothing in particular. He'd been given the clock in 1987 by a chief petty officer named Aldridge, who was retiring after 30 years. The movement inside was a genuine American railroad-grade pocket watch movement, adapted for case mounting. A Hamilton 992B, 17 jewels, adjusted to 5 positions, manufactured in Lancaster, Pennsylvania during the Second World War. Aldridge had found it in a pawn shop in Norfolk, Virginia, and had paid $17 for it because the case was cracked and the hands were missing, and no one behind the counter knew what they had. Edmund had cleaned and serviced the movement as a favor, and Aldridge had insisted he keep it. It had run perfectly for 22 years after that. Then Beverly had become sick, and Edmund had stopped noticing things like clocks. and when he finally thought to look at it again, sometime after the move to Millhaven, he found it silent. He'd put it in a box and told himself he'd deal with it later. Later had taken 8 years to arrive. He drove to Cole & Sons because it was the only repair shop within 40 miles that advertised antique movement. He had not expected the young man behind the counter to treat him well exactly. He had expected a professional assessment. What he got instead was a smirk and a dismissal that reminded him of something he hadn't thought about in years. A young lieutenant who'd once told him, in front of a room full of officers, that his methods were outdated and that modern diagnostic equipment had made his kind of expertise obsolete. That lieutenant had been wrong then. Nathan Cole was wrong now. The difference was that Edmund was no longer inside a chain of command. He no longer had to absorb the insult and move on. That evening, Edmund Reese Goss opened his garage for the first time in 8 years. He had kept the tools in good order, even while not using them. This was the habit of a man who had spent 3 decades in environments where a tool left improperly stored could fail at the exact moment it was needed most. His loops hung on a pegboard in descending magnification order. His movement holders were arranged by size. His oiling supplies were sealed and climate-controlled in a small cabinet he'd built himself because temperature variation degrades lubricants in ways that amateur watchmakers never consider. His timing machine, an old Witschi that he'd owned since 1979's, sat under a dust cover that Edmund removed with a care that bordered on ceremony. He set the clock case on his bench and switched on his work lamp, a daylight spectrum bulb he'd been using since 1983 because fluorescent light creates shadows at the wrong angles. And he began. The first step always is to understand what you're working with before you touch a single thing. Edmund spent 40 minutes doing nothing but looking. He used a 3/5-eye loop to examine the exterior of the case, noting where the cracks had propagated, which ones were structural and which were cosmetic, whether the wood had warped or merely surface checked. He examined the dial through the crystal, assessing the condition of the numerals, the integrity of the chapter ring, the state of the dial feet. He looked at the crown wheel through the case back, using a 10x loop before he ever considered opening anything. This is not impatience. This is the opposite of impatience. A watchmaker who opens a movement before fully understanding its condition will introduce variables he cannot control. Edmund had seen expensive restorations fail because someone had rushed to disassemble before they knew what they were disassembling into. What he saw told him several things. The hairspring appeared intact, which was the most important news, because a broken or distorted hairspring on an antique movement is a restoration-ending problem without access to a parts donor. The mainspring was almost certainly fatigued. After 80 years that was expected, but fatigue is not the same as failure, and replacement mainsprings for Hamilton 992B movements were available from established parts suppliers, though increasingly rare. The escapement was his primary concern. The pallets and escape wheel on a movement this age, if they had dried out, could show wear patterns that made the beat irregular, the power inconsistent, the accuracy useless, but none of that was catastrophic. Not yet. Edmund opened the case back with a tool he'd made himself in 1991 from a piece of hardened steel rod, his case knife, shaped to fit the specific radius of American-made casebacks from the 1930s through 1950s, and looked at the movement for the first time in 8 years. It was in better condition than he'd expected. Dust, yes. Some oxidation on the brass bridgework, not unusual for a movement that had been stored without moisture control. A small amount of congealed lubricant visible at the click spring, which was the probable cause of the stoppage. Old grease turns to something resembling amber shellac over time, and when it reaches the wrong component, it acts as a mechanical brake. This was a common failure mode on movements that had been serviced with petroleum-based oils, which were standard practice in the mid-century, and are now understood to be inferior to synthetic compounds for long-term stability. Here is something worth understanding, because it changes the way you think about old watches and old watchmakers both. Mechanical watch movements, properly made and properly maintained, do not have a natural lifespan in the way that electronic devices do. A Hamilton 992P, manufactured in the 1940s, contains no component that degrades simply through the passage of time if the movement is kept clean and correctly lubricated. The steel alloys used in American railroad movements were chosen specifically for hardness and dimensional stability. The jewels are synthetic sapphire and do not wear. The brass bridges and plates, if they've avoided catastrophic damage, remain dimensionally accurate indefinitely. What fails in old watches is almost always not the parts themselves, but the lubricants, the oils that become sticky, then solid, then abrasive, and the accumulated debris of storage. A properly executed service removes both problems. The movement that emerges is, functionally, a new movement inside antique parts, capable of decades more accurate service. Nathan Cole had said the mainspring was ready to snap. This is a common assumption among repair people who do not understand the difference between fatigue and fracture, between a spring that has lost some of its rated tension and a spring that is about to fail. Edmund checked the mainspring under magnification before removing it. It showed fatigue. It did not show crack initiation. It would be replaced regardless, because replacement was correct practice, but the young man's confident declaration had been wrong in its certainty. Being wrong in your certainty is more dangerous than simply being wrong, because it closes off the possibility of learning. Edmund worked for the rest of that evening and into the early hours of the following morning. He disassembled the movement completely, cataloguing each component in the order of removal. He still used a hand-drawn diagram on paper rather than photography, a habit from the years before digital CRIS existed, and one he'd never seen any reason to change. Each wheel, each pinion, each jeweled setting, each screw, each spring received a notation. He set the components in a movement tray with 112 individual compartments, purchased in Switzerland in 1984 and still the finest tray he'd ever used. The cleaning came next. Edmund had an ultrasonic cleaner, but he did not begin with it. He began with what his first instructor had called the eye clean, a thorough examination of each component under 10x magnification before any cleaning, because cleaning can obscure damage that needs to be seen and assessed first. It also reveals the specific type of contamination present, which determines the correct cleaning protocol. The balance staff, the tiny axle on which the balance wheel rotates, showed no visible wear to the pivots. This was the best possible news. A worn pivot on an antique movement requires either a replacement staff, which must match the original dimensions exactly, or a lathe operation to rebuild the pivot surface, which requires expertise that almost no living watchmaker under 60 still possesses. Edmund possessed it. He had spent 3 years learning to turn pivots on a watch lathe in the early 1980s, under an instructor who'd learned the skill in Switzerland in the 1950s. He hoped he wouldn't need it. He didn't. 4 days into the restoration, Edmund Rees-Goss sat at his bench with the Hamilton 992B, fully disassembled, cleaned in 3 successive baths of watch cleaning solution, followed by rinse solution, followed by dry. Each component inspected and cleared, the replacement mainspring sourced and delivered from a parts dealer in upstate New York who specialized in American railroad movements, and he allowed himself something he rarely allowed during work. He sat still for a moment and simply thought. He thought about Aldridge, who was almost certainly dead by now. He would have been 92. He thought about Beverly, who had loved the sound of the clock in the hallway of their house in Norfolk, who had said once that it was the only thing that made a house feel like a real house, a clock that you could hear breathing. He thought about his daughter in Portland, who called on Sundays and asked questions about his health and didn't know what her father had spent 31 years doing. He thought briefly about the young man at Cole & Sons, and then he put that thought away. It didn't serve the work, and the work was what mattered. Edmund reassembled the movement over the course of the following day and a half, working at the pace the movement required rather than the pace his schedule might have preferred. The reassembly of a movement like the Hamilton 992B is not the reverse of disassembly. It is a separate skill requiring a different kind of attention, the kind that holds a dozen interdependencies in mind simultaneously while the hands work independently. The barrel must be tensioned correctly before it is cased. The train wheels must seat without bind. The pallet fork must engage the escape wheel at precisely the correct depth of lock and draw. These relationships are not adjustable in the way that modern movements are adjustable. They were set when the movement was manufactured, and restoring them requires returning to those original specifications with a precision that admits no rounding. Edmund poised the movement, suspended it between the pads of his movement holder, and watched the balance wheel begin to swing. The amplitude was good. The beat sounded even, with the characteristic sound of a properly functioning lever escapement, a tick that was neither too heavy nor too light, each tooth of the escape wheel released with the same energy as the last. He placed it on the timing machine. The results made him smile. +2 seconds per day in the dial-up position, -1 second in crown left. For a movement that had been sitting silent for 8 years, that was remarkable. He adjusted the regulator, the small lever that effectively lengthens or shortens the active portion of the hairspring, changing the rate, with a tool small enough that he could barely see it with his naked eye, and checked the timing again. +1 second per day across 4 positions. That was within railroad grade specification. That was within the tolerance required in 1944 to keep trains running on time across the eastern United States. On a movement 80 years old, repaired in a garage in Tennessee by a man who hadn't opened that garage in 8 years. The case restoration took an additional 2 days. Edmund worked the cracked walnut carefully, using a technique he'd learned not from watchmaking, but from a furniture restorer in Connecticut he'd met at a parts show in 1992. A method of consolidating cracked wood with thin cyanoacrylate, followed by a hand-planed surface restoration that preserved the original wood rather than filling it with compound. The cracks became almost invisible, became a story the wood told about itself, rather than a failure. He refinished the case with traditional oil and wax rather than lacquer. Lacquer obscures the grain, creates a surface that is fundamentally separate from the wood beneath it, and is not historically appropriate for American clock cases of this period. The oil finish he used took 4 applications over 2 days, each application rubbed in by hand with a cloth that Edmund kept specifically for this purpose, the same cloth he'd used on wood restorations for 20 years. It smelled like linseed and beeswax, and something that, if Edmund were forced to name it, he would have called history, though he would have felt self-conscious saying so. He rehung the movement in the restored case, reinstalled the hands, a replacement pair sourced from the same New York dealer, old stock, unissued, still in their original envelope, and wound the clock for the first time. The tick that came out of that walnut case was the same tick Beverly had heard in the hallway of their house in Norfolk. Edmund Reese Goss sat in his garage at 11 o'clock on a Thursday night, listening to a clock that shouldn't have been savable, and he did not feel anything dramatic. He felt what craftsmen feel when a thing is right, a quiet certainty, clean and without sentiment, the kind of satisfaction that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need to. 12 days after being told that his clock was fit for a scrapyard, Edmund drove back to Cole & Sons' fine timepieces. He was not going back to prove anything. That was not why he went. He went because the town of Millhaven had one clockmaker, and that clockmaker needed to understand something that would make him better at his work, and the only way to communicate it was to show him. The shop was not busy when Edmund walked in. Nathan Cole was at his bench, working on what appeared to be a battery-operated quartz movement, the kind of work that required a parts swap and 15 minutes and no particular skill. He looked up when the door opened. "Oh," Nathan said. "You again." Edmund set the clock on the counter. He had not wrapped it this time. Nathan Cole stopped what he was doing. The walnut case caught the light in the shop and held it, the grain deep and warm, the oil finish doing what oil finishes do, making the wood look like wood rather than like wood covered in something. The hands were correct. The dial was clean. And from inside the case, in the quiet of the shop, came a sound that Nathan had not expected to hear. Tick, tick, tick. Nathan came to the counter slowly, the way people approach things they don't quite believe are real. He leaned down until his face was level with the clock, listening. His expression went through several things in the space of a few seconds. Surprise, then something that was almost disbelief, then a look that Edmund recognized because he had seen it on the faces of young technicians for 3 decades. The look of someone who has just understood, for the first time, the distance between what they know and what is knowable. "This is the same clock," Nathan said. It was not really a question. "It is," Edmund said. "The Hamilton 992B movement. Yes, I told you the escapement was probably fused." "You did." Nathan straightened up. He was quiet for a moment, and Edmund let the silence sit without filling it, because silence after a mistake is not nothing. It is the space in which a person decides what kind of person they're going to be. "It wasn't fused," Nathan said finally. "No, congealed lubricant at the click spring. Probably happened sometime in the mid-90s, based on the type of oil and the way it had set. Classic failure mode for petroleum-based lubricants in low unity storage. Nathan was quiet again. Then, how did you get the case grain to come back like that? I've never seen that on a piece this old. Thin signer consolidation first, then surface plane, then oil and wax over 4 applications. Nathan looked at him. Where did you learn that? Parts show in Connecticut, 1992. Furniture restorer, not a watchmaker. The best techniques don't always come from inside the discipline. Something shifted in Nathan Cole's face. Not remorse exactly. Edmund wasn't interested in remorse, but something more useful. Attention. The particular quality of attention that belongs to someone who has just discovered that the room they've been standing in is larger than they thought. I was wrong, Nathan said, about the clock. And about... He paused. About you. Edmund nodded. He accepted this without elaboration, the way he accepted most things. Simply without the need to perform either graciousness or vindication. I've been doing this for 6 years, Nathan said, more quietly now, and I still don't know how to turn a pivot. No, Edmund agreed. Most people your age don't. Is that something? Nathan stopped. Started again. Is that something that can still be learned, or is it the kind of thing you had to start young to? You're 28, Edmund said. I was 31 when I learned. From a man who was 64, who'd learned it from someone who was 70, who'd learned it in Biel from a man who is now long dead. The knowledge moves forward or it disappears. Those are the only 2 directions. He picked up the clock and looked at it for a moment before tucking it back under his arm. I'm on Persimmon Road, Edmund said. The house with the white mailbox and the old Ford in the driveway. I'm in the garage most mornings by 7. You can stop by if you want to. He left Nathan Cole standing behind his counter, and he drove home with the clock on the passenger seat, keeping time. What happened after that was not dramatic, because real things rarely are. Nathan Cole showed up on a Saturday morning 4 weeks later with a movement he'd broken during a poorly executed disassembly. A Waltham 1899 that he'd stripped a screw on and couldn't figure out how to recover. He stood at Edmund's garage door with the movement in a tray and the particular expression of a man who has had to set his ego down somewhere outside and isn't entirely sure where he left it. Edmund looked at the movement, assessed the problem in approximately 10 seconds, and said, "Come in." He didn't make it easy, and he didn't pretend it was easy. He showed Nathan the correct tool for the extraction, a graver, not a screwdriver, a distinction that takes years to internalize, and he made Nathan do the work himself while Edmund watched. When Nathan made the wrong movement with his wrist, Edmund said so. When Nathan paused and looked up for reassurance, Edmund said, "Don't look at me, look at the movement." When Nathan finally extracted the strip screw without further damage, Edmund said, "Again, same technique, until it feels natural." This is how knowledge actually transfers. Not in lectures, not in demonstrations performed for an audience. In the repeated specific correction of specific errors, until the hands know what the mind has to be taught to forget it ever had to think about. Nathan came back the following Saturday, and the one after that. He brought other problems and other questions, and Edmund answered the questions that deserved answers and redirected the ones that didn't. He taught Nathan to use a timing machine correctly, not just to read the number it produced, but to understand what the number meant and what was causing it. He taught him the difference between a movement that needed cleaning and a movement that needed adjustment, a distinction that sounds simple and requires years to actually perceive. He taught him that the first question when a watch comes to the bench is never "what's wrong with it?" but rather "what is it?" There is something worth saying about why this matters, and it is this. The knowledge that men like Edmund Rees Goss carry is not written down anywhere that matters. There are books on watchmaking. There are YouTube channels on watchmaking. There are schools that teach watchmaking in compressed curricula designed to produce competent technicians in 18 months. None of these sources carry what 31 years of working on instruments where failure was not an option will teach a person. The calibration of judgment that comes from being held accountable at the level of a human life for the precision of your work. That is not a teachable subject in any conventional sense. It can only be transmitted, one person to another, in a room where both people are paying attention. Edmund had spent his career in classified facilities and could not talk about the specifics of his work, even now, but the principles that governed it: patience before action, observation before diagnosis, understanding before intervention. Those were principles that belonged to no classification level. Those were the things he could give away. Edmund Rees Goss is still on Persimmon Road. He is 78 now, and General the dog is 12, and both of them move with the deliberate care of beings who have learned that there is no advantage in hurrying. The clock with the Hamilton 992B movement sits on the mantelpiece in his living room, and it has not lost or gained more than 30 seconds total in the 2 years since he restored it, which is an accuracy that some new Swiss watches would be embarrassed to claim. Nathan Cole still runs the shop on Millhaven's main street. The name above the door still says Cole & Sons, the name his grandfather chose, but the work done inside has changed. There is now a small sign in the window, added about 8 months after Nathan first appeared at the garage on Persimmon Road, that reads, "Antique movement service available." He turned a pivot for the first time last spring on a lathe Edmund let him borrow, and when the pivot fit the jewel without shake, he texted Edmund a photograph of it at 7 in the morning without any accompanying message, because there wasn't anything to say that the photograph didn't already say. Edmund didn't reply until 9, when he was done with his walk and had his coffee, and what he wrote was, "Good. Now do it again fast." Somewhere in a box in Edmund's garage, there is a photograph of a man named Aldridge, Chief Petty Officer Aldridge, standing in front of a building that doesn't exist on any public map, shaking hands with a young Edmund Goss who is not yet 30 years old and does not yet understand how much he doesn't know. The photograph is not labelled. If you didn't know what you were looking at, you would see 2 men in government-issue clothing squinting into what appears to be a bright Virginia afternoon, both of them smiling at something off-camera. Edmund knows what they were smiling at. It was a movement that everyone said couldn't be fixed, sitting on a bench behind them, running. Some things are worth saving. Some knowledge is worth passing on. And some people, the quiet ones, the ones who don't explain themselves, the ones who wave from their porch and don't stop to talk, some of those people have been trusted with things that the rest of us have no idea existed. The trick, if there is one, is learning to look before you dismiss, before you decide you already know, before you tell someone the best thing to do is throw it away. The clock on Edmund's mantelpiece ticks. It has been ticking for 80 years, through wars and workshops and a pawn shop in Norfolk and a box in an attic and a quiet garage in Tennessee, and it will keep ticking long after everyone in this story is gone. That's what it means to build something right. That's what it means to know what you're doing. That's what experience looks like from the outside when you finally learn how to see it.